Stupid, Lazaro, you can't figure things out. Here's the problem, Tag, if you can figure out this equation, you will get my wally early pie. What happens when a fictitious provocation comes the worst error of his career? In today's story, a 12-year-old black boy with quiet and timid feels humiliated after his math teacher confronts him with an apparently difficult assignment. What follows will cause you to consider all of your preconceived notions about evaluating people based just on their outward looks. You will be greatly moved by this story, which also serves as a reminder of how important it is to treat every child with the respect they deserve. Tell us where you are watching from for WA at back. Make sure to subscribe if this style has matched with you because I have something very unique planned for you tomorrow. Arithmetic class home window let in a soft stream of afternoon light that bounced off the edge at desks and chairs. In the third hall, Lazaro Silva sat lost in his own thoughts, staring at the blank notebook in front of him. Despite silence, the tension in the classroom was evident. Rodrigo Alvarenga, the instructor, stood in front of the class grinning sarcastically. Since Lazaro was the only black kid in his class, he always made it a point to target him with his most critical remarks. Rodrigo gave Lazaro a superior look, as though he were about to impart to him a knowledge of incalculable power in addition to mathematics. The pressure was felt by the class. The instructor might have made seems uncomfortable without raising his voice. Lazaro remained still. Although his eyes were focused on the board, his thoughts appeared to be afar. A steady were his personal mission to end sudden stillness, Rodrigo's pleasure was palpable. And he appeared to have discovered the ideal chance to do so at that very moment. Nobody was aware of the kid's strength, intelligence, and focus that lay beneath Lazaro's composite exterior and were about to be put to the test. Over, he simply absorbed Rodrigo's contemptuous stare at that precise time. Lazaro remained silent as the class whispered to one another. He was aware that the teacher was looking for a response, an error, or something that would confirm his preconceived notion that Lazaro wasn't supposed to be there. Rodrigo started writing a complicated equation on the board. He introduced the assignment with a sardonic smile, knowing that even older kids would find this problem extremely challenging. With a ton of disdain, let's see if our young prodigy can do this. There was silence in the home. Everyone's eyes were on Lazaro, anticipating this failure and humiliation. Over, Lazaro's eyes conveyed the sense that story was only getting started. Standing with his hands on the table, Rodrigo Alvarenga observed every look that was directed at the board. With its many symbols, differential equations, and entangled variables, the problem he had written appeared to be a masterwork of mathematics. It seemed to be lost on everyone in the room. Like an unbreakable code, the intricate equations created a labyrinth of numbers and functions. However, Lazaro seemed unfazed by the equation, despite Rodrigo's expectations. With remarkable composure, he simply observed, taking in every aspect. There was a tight silence in the classroom when the sound of pencils scratching the paper vanished. A few pupils gazed anxiously at the board, attempting to make sense of what was going on, but the majority had already given up. Lucas Martins, who appeared worried about what was going to happen, looked at Clara Gomez, who was seated in the front row. There was a sense of anticipation, as though everyone was waiting for something significant or surprising, but nobody knew what the teacher expected from Lazaro. However, Lazaro appeared to be unaffected by the pressure. Rodrigo looked on in skepticism, hoping Lazaro would not succeed. No one, especially a youngster so young, could answer that challenge, he thought. The intention was to humiliate Lazaro in front of the class as well as to provide a challenging question to him. Rodrigo made this desire clear with every gesture, but Lazarus remained apathetic, seemingly cut off from the outside world. He was not afraid, even though he knew that the biggest challenge of his life was about to come. Gazing disdainfully at the students' efforts, Rodrigo started to move around the room. Who among us believes they can resolve this? In a sarcastic tone, he said. Rodrigo looked at Lazaro once more, as though he was questioning the boy's bravery. He wanted Lazaro's impending failure to be seen by the class. Lazaro, however, refused to back down. He was prepared. He saw no barrier in his thinking. He saw a chance to demonstrate something more profound than mathematics. Something nobody in that setting anticipated. Still grinning cynically, Rodrigo spoke directly to Lazaro. Lazaro, are you certain you comprehend this? He emphasized it cruelly. It was clear that he was being sarcastic, as though he were doubting the student's intelligence. The atmosphere became strained as the room became even silent. Some classmates gave Lazaro a sympathetic glance, while others felt uneasy, but most of them said nothing because of Rodrigo's actions. But Lazaro remained silent. He was aware that whatever defense he offered would simply serve to further the teacher's intended humiliation of him. More as a provocation than a sincere pledge, Rodrigo declared, "My entire salary is yours if you can solve this." Rodrigo's tone made it clear that this was not a genuine offer, even though Lazaro heard the ridiculous sum being mentioned. His belief that a pupil like Lazaro, who was out of place among the others, couldn't comprehend such mathematical intricacy was reinforced by the trap. Lazaro's eyes remained fixed. He was aware that the respect and dignity the teacher denied him were more important than the pay. Rodrigo made it apparent that he thought Lazaro was only there due to a policy, not because of merit, when he brought up affirmative action. "Wasn't it affirmative action that placed you in this class?" He spoke in a tone that bordered on disdain. Although some students were aware of the covert racism in Rodrigo's remarks, no one ventured to question him. Lazaro was aware that his presence there was viewed by many as an anomaly, a chance brought about by outside forces. But he understood more than anyone else that his aptitude was the reason he was there. Lazaro said nothing. He was both a victim and a resistance to that humiliation. Not because he was angry, but rather due to the intensity of his focus and stillness. His intense emotional control and unwavering focus on the board demonstrated an inner power that nobody else completely comprehended. As the room awaited, he realized that the struggle to be accepted for more than his skin tone was the greater obstacle, not the math issue. He didn't have to convince Rodrigo of anything, but he had to see what was happening. In the front row, Clara Gomez watched the drama develop in front of her with great interest. She had previously observed the teacher's unsettling conduct, but never with such clarity. There was no denying the change in how he treated Lazaro. Her stomach was roiling with increasing outrage, and she felt a lump in her throat. She was aware that the situation there included more than simple math. It was about who was entitled to be in that classroom, and it was about something deeper and more significant. Lazaro was facing difficulties not just with the equation but also with his own presence in the classroom. Although Clara and Lazaro had always been friends, she felt compelled to stand up for him right then and there in order to demonstrate to others how wrong their treatment of him was. She cast a helpless glance at Lucas Martins, who was seated beside her. She was aware, however, that he shared her outrage. Clara inhaled deeply. She was unable to keep quiet any longer. She carefully got to her feet, aware that everyone in the room was watching her. She said, "This isn't right," more to herself than to anybody else, but it was enough to increase the tension in the room. Clara tried to read Lazaro's emotions by examining his face. His quiet spoke more than words, but the pain was invisible. He was defending himself against something more significant than merely taking in the teacher's remarks. Clara was aware that raising her voice would just result in a pointless complaint that would not be followed through on. However, her heart was unable to overlook the situation any longer. How could this kind of treatment be applied to someone? And why? She was obsessed by the tension between her need to protect Lazaro and her helplessness in the face of the circumstance. Something inside Clara broke when the teacher laughed. That chuckle wasn't merely jest. She had always known there was discrimination, but it had never been so overtly stated. She wasn't sure whether she should get up or say anything else, but she felt compelled to do so. With a firmer tone, Clara remarked, "Professor, you're going too far." She was not intimidated by Rodrigo's contemptuous gaze. She realized then that something needed to change. Every time the teacher spoke, Tommy Martins, who was seated next to Lazaro, felt the pain intensify. He understood that Lazaro was being ripped apart on the inside, even if he observed his friend's composed expression. Tommy had always been aware of his friend's intelligence, but he was heartbroken to witness the abuse he was getting. He stretched out and caressed Lazaro's shoulder without hesitation. "Bro, don't worry. They're unaware of your abilities," he said. It was all he had to offer at the time, and he realized it wasn't much. However, his deed was a sign of tacit support. Anger was building inside Tommy. In addition to degrading Lazarus, the instructor's actions undermined the school's reputation and undermined the pupils' faith in their teacher. He wanted to yell, get to his feet, and confront Rodrigo, but he knew that would only make things worse for Lazarus. But Tommy's fury was too strong to restrain. In order to express his disapproval of this psychological anguish, he intended to face the teacher. Instead, he kept his composure and waited for the ideal opportunity. Tommy was aware that he could express his support for Lazaro without using words. The touch on his friend's shoulder, his silence, and his actions all constituted a silent challenge to Rodrigo. He was aware that attitude, rather than words, was the true power at that moment. He remained steadfast, observing the teacher's every action. Despite his silence, Tommy's fury was becoming more apparent by the second, and his gaze was clear and resolute. Tommy resisted the impulse to get up and confront the teacher as Rodrigo persisted in his taunts. However, his greatest desire was for Lazaro to be given the opportunity to shine and demonstrate his true abilities to everyone. The unfairness in front of him was an insult to equality and respect, which the educational system ought to stand for, rather than merely targeting one student. Tommy was aware that he had to take note of this event. He fought for justice by being by Lazaro's side, even if he didn't say anything. Despite the teacher's overt provocation, Lazaro Silva remained mute and unfazed. He was aware that the respect he so richly deserved was at risk, not simply the equation on the board. Rodrigo stared at him, searching for a response, a weakness. Lazaro, however, refused to back down. Calmly and without hurry, he got up and walked to the front of the room. Tension increased as the gentle sound of chalk hitting the board reverberated across the space. Lazaro was questioning the teacher's limited perspective of him, not only figuring out an equation. He was aware that he was tackling something far more significant than a straightforward arithmetic problem when he picked up that chalk. The classroom's atmosphere abruptly altered. Anticipation took the place of the silence that had before pervaded the atmosphere. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, all of the students observed Lazarus carefully. Although they were unsure of what would happen next, Lazarus' actions gave them the impression that something amazing was about to happen. However, the teacher appeared even more assured, aware that his challenge had been too great but still expecting Lazaro to fail. Although Rodrigo's ruthless grin persisted, something within him was starting to falter. He was unable to comprehend Lazaro's composure. With unexpected lucidity, Lazaro examined the equation displayed on the board. He saw a map instead of a scramble of symbols and numbers. Every phrase and variable had a relationship and a meaning. He started working with a calm assurance, creating symbols and lines on the board with remarkable accuracy. His fingers flowed with assurance, as though arithmetic came naturally to him and he was an easy master of it. Everyone in the audience was engrossed as they saw Lazaro calmly and lucidly unravel the problem's intricacy. The classroom appeared to change as the minutes went by and the equation took shape. The tension that Rodrigo had created started to ease. Lazaro was doing more than just figuring out a challenging calculation. He was tearing down the teacher's perspective and the preconceptions that had been applied to him. Every stage of his solution was a blow to the bigoted notion that he wasn't welcome there. Lazaro was demonstrating to Rodrigo and everyone else in the room that genuine skill cannot be assessed based solely on appearance or presumptions. He was demonstrating that he deserved his position there. Lazarus was still working through the calculation when an unexpected event occurred. Tommy, who had been quiet up until that point, was at his breaking point. Abruptly, he rose to his feet, his face flushed with anger. His voice quivered with rage as he continued, "That's not right, Professor." Without hesitation, Clara joined Lazarus, who was already uneasy about his treatment. "He's figuring things out." "There's no doubting that," she stated firmly. Their assistance illuminated the room like a spark. Other pupils started to move, with some quietly getting to their feet and others looking at each other encouragingly. The environment in the room was shifting from one of shame to one in which demands for justice were starting to be made. "Tell us where you are watching from before we head back." Make sure to subscribe if this tale resonates with you because I have something very unique planned for you tomorrow. Professor Rodrigo was shocked to see his pupils start to rebel against him. What had once appeared to be a battleground between him and Lazarus alone was now evolving into one in which members of his own class were opposing him. Those who had remained indifferent started to get up and come to Lazarus. Some merely observed, but it was evident from their eyes that they were silently but firmly in favor. The teacher felt that he was starting to lose his authority since up until that point, he thought he had total control over the room. It did not take long for the collective support to take effect. Lazaro, who had before felt alone and challenged, was now burdened by his peer support. Lazarus was the defender of respect and dignity, and the teacher was the defendant in what appeared to be a silent courtroom. The student's position was crucial in helping Rodrigo understand that the fight he had initiated was not just against Lazarus but also against anybody who dared to challenge his power. As the pressure increased, Rodrigo's confidence declined with each act of encouragement from a student. He made an effort to remain in charge, but it was obvious that he had lost control after Tommy and Clara's remarks and the disapproving looks from a few students. This was more than just a simple calculation error for the teacher. It was the collapse of what he considered to be an indestructible system. The classroom was no longer merely a place of instruction, it was also a platform for resistance to covert bigotry and oppression. Slowly, the door to the classroom opened. Everyone turned to see Principal Elisa Zantana, who walked in with a calm and authoritative stance but a penetrating stare that seemed to take in everything. She was a naturally authoritative woman whose presence instantly silenced the students. The cycle of tension that had been building was broken by her entrance. Although he tried to conceal his uneasiness, Rodrigo's eyes betrayed his trepidation. In contrast to the increasing anger in the room, the principal observed the scene with a calm demeanor. Everyone's eyes were on Elisa as she moved to the middle of the room. Trying to keep his cool, Rodrigo got to his feet. "It's good to see you, Principal," he remarked, smiling artificially. Elisa did not smile as she gave him a direct gaze. "Mr. Alvarenga, I noticed students rising when I heard a commotion. What's happening?" She posed the issue coolly but with undeniable power. It was evident from the tone of her voice that she was there to fully comprehend the situation rather than only listen to explanations. The principal kept a careful eye on Rodrigo, seeing past appearances. She had heard of the teacher's behavior previously, so she understood exactly what was happening. Now, however, it was obvious. Elisa firmly stated, "My school will not tolerate this kind of behavior, Mr. Alvarenga." She was aware that inequity, not even under the pretense of academic authority, could not be accepted. As the pupils observed and felt Elisa's authority echoing through her words, the tension in the room grew. Elisa listened to the teacher's statements without responding, but her expression showed her mounting discontent as Rodrigo attempted to defend his behavior. The principal's unflappable composure stood in sharp contrast to Rodrigo's haughty demeanor. The issue was no longer beyond Rodrigo's control, he was now the subject of a trial and had to bear the consequences of his conduct. Elisa was aware that it was time to make the required adjustment. Marcus stayed motionless and observed the incident with remarkable composure as Principal Elisa Santana carried on speaking with the teacher. He was aware that the time had come to tell his real story. "Mr. Alvarenga, you don't know who he really is, do you?" The principal turned to face the teacher, but she continued to stare at Marcus as she spoke. As everyone waited for the response, the room became quiet. Marcus finally spoke after giving the teacher a composed glance. "My mother teaches math at MIT, and my father works as an aerospace engineer. I learned from them at a young age." The information was shocking. Startled, the students started whispering. Nobody there was aware that Marcus had access to higher education since he was a little boy and that he came from such a prestigious family. Marcus went on, his tone steady but stern. "My mother is an expert in applied mathematics, concentrating on differential equations." In addition to disclosing details about his past, he was also questioning the bias that the professor had implied in his remarks. He was demonstrating that his being there was neither an accident nor a result of outside policies. It was the outcome of perseverance and a learning process that started long before he walked into that room. The news shocked Rodrigo Alvarenga, who had been attempting to keep things under control up until that point. It had never occurred to him that Marcus had such skill and experience. But Marcus was obviously not trying to brag because of the manner he spoke, which was free of conceit or haughtiness. "I never requested special treatment." Marcus returned his focus to the board and continued, "I just wanted to be seen as another student." He was standing up for himself, but in a way that promoted truth rather than rage. Marcus's words had a profound effect that echoed around the room. He started to be viewed by the kids as someone who had been unfairly judged. His story's veracity instantly instilled a sense of respect and an awareness that he was much more than the black kid in the class. The principal was not surprised by this discovery. Marcus's impact on his peers was something she couldn't ignore, even if she had always known there was more to his story. She felt guilty for permitting this type of behavior to occur on behalf of all the pupils there. Rodrigo Alvarenga didn't say anything because he couldn't respond to Marcus's statement right away. Marcus was shocked to learn that his excellent education was not a coincidence and that he came from a family with a high level of education. In a matter of seconds, everything he believed to be true about the student was ruined. He searched for a response, a rationale for the actions he had just performed, but the words were insufficient. His eyes scanned the board, but he couldn't think of anything to say. The tension he had produced appeared to vibrate through the entire room, which had been silent before. Rodrigo made an effort to keep up his commanding stats, but he was unable to conceal the uneasiness that suddenly consumed his body. What had been a sardonic smile vanished from his face. He turned to face the kids, who appeared to be waiting for him to say something else. The irony was obvious. The educator, who had always taken pride in his position of authority, now found himself confronted with a reality he was ill-equipped to handle. He was the one being exposed after he had done the unimaginable and revealed his biased views in front of the class. Previously silent, the students were now split between shock and indignation. They had seen a moral shortcoming, something more than a straightforward mathematical dispute. In the classroom, a communal consciousness was quickly emerging. The other students' silent support and Clara and Tommy's outrage seemed to agree on one thing: the teacher no longer had the right to be treated with dignity. Furthermore, he no longer had the authority to influence their perspective. Throughout all of this, Marcus remained unwavering and made no signs of disdain. He was aware that the idea that he had to prove himself to someone was being broken, in addition to the equation on the board. In addition to solving a mathematical puzzle, he was also conquering a system that attempted to silence him and deny him a position there. Marcus responded eloquently by being silent. He didn't have to defend himself anymore. Everyone could see the truth. The chamber, which had been used for arithmetic instruction, was now a quiet courtroom with distinct responsibilities for the judge and the defendant. Every student appeared to be waiting for the ultimate decision, and the hush was almost tangible. Once confident in his position, Professor Rodrigo Alvarenga now had his authority called into doubt. In addition to his students, he was also being assessed on the morality of his deeds, which had been brutally and unavoidably revealed. With his head held high, Lazaro took center stage in the argument, and Rodrigo had no way out. The balance of power, which had usually benefited the teacher, was upset when the environment of condemnation grew more intense. Lazaro took charge of the room without using words. His mathematical prowess and composed manner were self-evident. The teacher had attempted to use him as a failure case, but now he was disarmed, without a defense, and his own ineptitude and bias had rendered his authority useless. The kids came to understand that genuine power came from one's integrity and respect rather than from one's position. Marcus gradually gained the support of the pupils. Some raised their hands in solidarity, others whispered words of encouragement, and even some who had initially remained silent started to express their agreement. The classroom atmosphere was shifting, and Rodrigo could no longer overlook how strongly the pupils were together. With his composure and skill, Marcus was not only questioning the equation on the board but also the notion that he was an exception. The entire class was now on his side, so he wasn't alone. The idea of justice, which had before appeared abstract, was now tangible, alive, and visible to everybody. Marcus taught more about morals than any arithmetic lesson could by confronting Rodrigo's unfairness with wisdom and dignity. At that point, the classroom evolved from a setting for intellectual instruction to one for moral learning. Everyone understood the true lesson: justice is about how we choose to behave when the law is in conflict with our moral convictions, not merely about following the letter of the law. Lazaro carefully started to describe the method that had brought him to the solution after taking a step back from the board. He looked at his coworkers and remarked, "This problem isn't just about numbers." His once timid voice had become firm and confident as he stated, "The real key is to understand that the variables here are not independent. They are interrelated and create a system of equations that need to be transformed." Even some of the school's teachers could have found it difficult to fully comprehend his method of solving the problem, which involved breaking the equation down into smaller, more manageable portions. His mastery of mathematics was evident in each movement of his chalk on the board. While some students tried to follow the intricate processes, others just took in how clearly Lazaro described the problem. The class watched in silence. "To start, we use substitution to make the nested function simpler," he added precisely. He employed sophisticated language that nobody in the room expected to hear from a 7th grader. "Then we use partial fraction decomposition to separate the variables, making integration easier." Lazaro's grasp of complex mathematical ideas like fixed-point iteration and Laplace transformation demonstrated that he wasn't merely finding a solution, rather, he was questioning everyone's perception of their own skills. The room was in utter disbelief when Lazaro completed his solution. His actions appeared to be beyond anyone's comprehension. Some pupils were in utter disbelief, wondering how a 12-year-old could have such insight. Even the most accomplished mathematicians would struggle to replicate the elegance and precision of the solution he offered. Lazarus was suddenly viewed as having a talent that above all expectations by that class, which had previously viewed him as substandard. The whispers in the room became louder, but now they were whispers of respect and appreciation. Lazarus put the chalk on the table without hurrying and looked at the class with a neutral expression. He didn't require praise or approval. There it was, the unmistakable truth. There was no doubt about his intelligence. Rodrigo's confidence vanished when he turned to face the teacher. All that was left was the realization that Lazaro was a genius, and he had demonstrated this in front of everyone. Rodrigo Alvarenga stood motionless in front of the board, his face changing into a mix of incredulousness and restrained rage. He was now publicly humiliated for what had once been a cruel joke. A seemingly indestructible pride was finally crushed by Marcus' epiphany and the clarity with which he had solved the issue. Rodrigo was at a loss for words while the room waited, and he tried to explain the circumstances, but his words came across as meaningless. He had been hit with the truth and was unable to keep up his active power. In an attempt to restore control, Rodrigo glanced at the students, but all he saw on their faces was discomfort and disgust. His perceived self-assurance disintegrated, and his commanding presence vanished in front of everyone. He made an effort to maintain his reputation as an accomplished educator, but it was becoming more and more obvious that he had run out of reasons. The classroom, which had previously represented his power, was now a place where he was challenged, his mask removed, and his biases revealed. The pupils' collective silence acted as a kind of verdict. He was overcome with shame. The pupils started to shift, some looking at one another, some clearly uneasy. Lazaro, who had remained mute up until that point, felt the weight of being acknowledged as a student who, like everyone else, deserved to be there. But he was no longer the only person in the room. It was about any student who has ever been the object of unjust criticism or disdainful looks. The effect of what had transpired started to spread. Rodrigo's attitude still carried weight even though his words were now meaningless. Lazaro remained silent, observing the incident with his usual composure. He didn't have to quarrel or yell. His posture was the source of his resistance. He was conquering the stigmas society had attempted to place on him in addition to completing a challenging calculation. His victory was over the teachers and other pupils' narrow perception of his skills, not the math issue. The notion that his presence in that area was an error was what he was conquering. At last, he was being valued for what he really was. Lazaro, who was still standing at the board, went on to explain, going into great detail about how he arrived at the solution. Everyone in the room was pleased by the confidence and ease with which he delivered his words. He employed sophisticated techniques with remarkable proficiency and deconstructed the intricate problem into simpler parts. Everyone, including Principal Elisa Santana, observed him carefully as the intricacy of what he was doing became even more clear as he worked through the solution. As though describing a straightforward idea, he went on, "Now, we substitute the variables to integrate by parts." The pupils, some of whom were taking brief notes, were impressed by how easily Lazaro handled complex calculus concepts, and the room was quiet. If this story resonated with you, tell someone who needs motivation to stand up for what's right. Remember that empathy and respect have the capacity to change lives, and sign up for more transformational stories. Remember to never undervalue anybody based solely on their outward appearance.